and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I am your host for this podcast. Now, you may have noticed, it's just me. After some absolutely fantastic episodes interviewing some of my amazing colleagues, this time you just get me. Don't worry, there will be other people, there will be other amazing interviews coming up. But for this episode, I specifically wanted to focus on torture, medieval torture. I mean, that is my area of specialty after all. But before we start this episode, I just want to remind everybody that you can subscribe to this podcast on YouTube, Substack, and Patreon. And if you actually pay to subscribe on Substack and Patreon, there are all kinds of clips and shorts and some actual long segments that I've edited out of some of the interviews, because sometimes we go a little long. Sometimes we get really excited about what we're talking about and we don't pay attention to the time. And for those of you who have subscribed, thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. It is your interest that actually keep these things moving, and it makes these podcasts worthwhile. So I want to thank all of you who've already subscribed, paid subscribers especially, and I would like to encourage those of you who haven't paid to check out those payment options. Like I said, there's a lot of additional material on Substack and Patreon for paid subscribers. Also, I want to thank all of you who've been following me on TikTok and on Instagram. It's new for me to be on so many platforms, so I appreciate your attention and your patience. Now, I would like to start talking about medieval torture. Like I said, that's my area of specialty. And you might ask, how did a nice girl like me get into a subject like torture? Well, my first interest in torture started with my dissertation. You might think, well, how did that happen? When I was working at Trinity College Dublin as a graduate student, brand new graduate student, my supervisor, Professor John Scattergood, took me to the manuscript library. Now, that beautiful long hall library in Trinity College that people say, well, you can't read in there anymore. You can. If you are working on early printed books or if you're working on rare books, it is possible to read in that library, but at the moment, they're renovating it. For those of us who worked in manuscripts, though, the manuscript room was at the far end of the hall, so I got to walk through that gorgeous long hall library every day on my way to the manuscript reading room. On my first day of graduate school, after I was accepted into Trinity College, and this would be 1996, you can do the math, I don't mind telling you my age. In 1996, John Scattergood took me up to the manuscript reading room and presented me with two manuscripts. And he said, pick one. One manuscript was a 16th century Old Norse Icelandic bestiary bound in 17th century boards. And the other one was a collection of Middle English female saints' lives. In fact, it was actually not just female saints, but a Middle English version of the Gylfalegenda, which means the Golden Legend. Now, the Legenda Aurea, the Latin version of that text, was really, really popular, and it circulated in medieval Europe in the 13th century. It was compiled in about 1260 by Jacobus de Voragine, or Jacobus de Voragine, depending on whether you use Latin or whether you use French. And that text makes its way into England, and it's translated into Middle English. Now, Professor Scattergood said, pick one. He gave me two options. But he said that if I worked in Old Norse, he wouldn't be able to supervise me because he doesn't do Norse. He also suggested that the Middle English might be a bit more marketable when I was looking for jobs later, and he was right. But working on that collection of saints' lives and corresponding with scholars like Richard Hamer at Oxford and Vita Russell, who was working with Richard on the full Early English Text Society manuscript collection and edition, critical edition of all of those Gylfalegenda texts, working on those saints' lives gave me all kinds of avenues for further research and further study. And one of the things I noticed when I was looking at those saints' lives were the descriptions of torture. Now, I am sure that an awful lot of you are thinking, well, yes, it's the Middle Ages, torture, of course. That's the thing. That is where my research started. That is where my interest in looking at law and medicine and historical context in the relation to medieval literary texts actually started. So, now that I've given you that background, now that I've given you a bit of context, let's talk about torture. What is torture? Most of you use torture all the time. You use that term, torture, not actual torture. Sorry. You use the term torture all the time. People do. It's part of the English lexicon. It's often used to describe something painful and horrible, something really awful. That is torture. However, in the Middle Ages, torture has a very specific legal definition. Torture is the application of pain in the process of interrogatory discovery. You might think, well, there's some pretty awful things that medieval authorities did to others, nasty executions, hang, drawn, and quartering, beheading, flaying, all of that stuff. And we'll talk about that, I promise. In fact, I'll probably have a whole nother episode that will, again, be just me talking about medieval punishment, because that's a different thing. In medieval law, the application of pain in order to extract a confession, to extract information in the process of interrogation, that is torture. It comes from Latin tortore, meaning to twist. And in a lot of respects, the aspect of twisting or manipulating the body in some way to create pain in order to induce somebody to confess is the origin of the word itself. Now, in medieval legal tradition, torture can only be used in certain circumstances. And you use torture in order to elicit a confession. If somebody confesses, you don't apply torture. If somebody confesses to a crime, then they are judged, and then they are sentenced. And the sentence is punishment. So in medieval legal terms, torture is what you do before somebody confesses in order to get them to confess. Punishment is what you do after somebody has been found guilty of a crime, either through confession or through other systems of proof. And then the sentence that is levied against them, that is punishment. Those are two different things. And so part of what I want to talk about today is what is the difference between torture and punishment? What constitutes torture? What constitutes punishment? How often was this stuff used? We have an impression in the modern era, and I mean the last 100 years at least, that the Middle Ages was nothing but torture, that people tortured each other with impunity, that you have inquisitors, evil inquisitors like Bernardo Gui tromping across Europe with their own wagon laden full of torture devices. You have images, largely post-medieval images, of medieval authorities as sadistic, bloodthirsty, ripping their victims apart, throwing people in dungeons, hanging them from the walls in shackles, and subjecting them to the most heinous forms of torture. Now, there were certainly heinous forms of torture in the Middle Ages. There were certainly aspects of torture that were very nasty. And there were most definitively people who abused the system of torture in the Middle Ages. Absolutely. Authoritarian abuse of power is not new. And it's actually very important to point out in this particular context the boundaries of law and how medieval people understood that law had parameters. And that if you wanted to make sure that in the interests of justice, you convicted those who were actually guilty, you were going to try and find out the best possible means of establishing that guilt. But also, very importantly, you understood sometimes that some of those methods didn't work and had to be abandoned. So, with that caveat, let's start talking about medieval torture. Now, first of all, where do we get the impression that I just talked about? That impression that torture was everywhere. Everybody's doing it. There's torture all over the Middle Ages. Everybody's doing it. Popular culture. Modern popular culture is full of depictions of sadistic medieval torturers, sadistic medieval authorities, churchmen who subject people to torture. And usually they're the bad guys. Now, when I deliver my public lectures, and if you're in the DC, Baltimore area at any point in time and you want to hear me live in person talk about medieval torture, come hear me at Props and Pints. That is an amazing organization that sets up lectures for professors across all different disciplines, professors who talk on all manner of different things in local bars and breweries. And I present as part of Props and Pints in DC, in Annapolis, and in Baltimore, and occasionally in Philly. So if you ever want to hear me live, you can come to any of the Props and Pints and hear me talk about torture, medieval sex, and various religious holidays that have incorporated pre-Christian beliefs into their holiday systems. But I digress. When I talk in public about torture, I ask people, Game of Thrones? How many of you have seen Game of Thrones? How many of you base your impression of the Middle Ages off of Game of Thrones? Probably a lot of you. I'd ask for a show of hands, but I can't actually see you. Game of Thrones is an amazing medievalism, and we will have episodes that deal with medievalism specifically. In fact, I've written a number of pieces that incorporate the aspects of medievalisms, that is modern or post-medieval impressions of what it is to be medieval. Medievalisms, of course, are found all over the place, not just in popular culture. In fact, there's a current, well, it's not so much a controversy, but it was, in the removal of the Confederate statues in Richmond, Virginia, where I used to live. I used to live right down the street from all of those monuments that were removed in 2020 and then erased as they should be in the years subsequent to that. Let me tell you, history's not erased by removing statues to traitors. History is erased when you ignore that history and when you don't teach it. History is erased when you change the narrative and try to make it look better for you and your group of people. Whitewashing history, largely. And I only bring that up because in America, the current Secretary of Defense wants to reinstate those Confederate statues. That's a tangent too, but if you're interested in that, I will post a link to my Public Medievalist article on the aspects of chivalry and fascism in those statues in Richmond. But I bring it up because that's where we get a lot of our impressions about torture in the Middle Ages. Movies, TV series, they're out for an audience. They want to get you interested. And I mean, to be honest, an awful lot of audiences really rather enjoy all the gruesome, gory stuff. I mean, I have a threshold for gruesome. So it's not really my thing, but, and trust me, when I tell people I work in torture and brutality, people get all kinds of ideas. Don't get those ideas. That's not my thing either. But in popular culture, The image that we are presented with of the Middle Ages is one of bloodthirsty tyrants and punishments and corrupt clergy and corrupt rulers. We have these images. The bad guys employ torture and nasty punishments against the good guys. If you've seen Game of Thrones, the Boltons, think about it. Ramsay Bolton, who gets off on flaying and castrating and torturing people. There are movies that are full of medieval torture devices. All you have to do is listen to the news. And if you listen to the news, you will hear occasionally, and actually far more often than you might realize. And once I say it, you're going to hear it all the time. I promise you. Once I say it, you will hear it all the time. People use the phrase medieval to denote something backwards or barbaric or violent, but specifically something other. You hear it in reference to warfare or quote unquote uncivilized societies. The West, particularly America, and in some cases Europe, really like to present themselves as more civilized than other nations. So they might refer to somebody's practice as medieval. That is meant to denote somehow violent and brutal and unsophisticated. You see it in the news talking about terrorism. White Western Christian politicians will brand Islamic terrorists medieval in their brutality. Go look. The lead up to the Iraq War in 2003, that was all over the place. In the last few years, in 2015 and the lead up to the 2016 election, Republican politicians brought up torture all the time, largely to say, on the one hand, our enemies are medieval in their savagery, but also doubling down on the prospect of using torture. Since the current presidential administration was sworn in January of this year, the language about torture has ramped up again. Discussions of putting people in essentially concentration camps in Florida, illegal detention centers to round up dissidents and round up people who really only have committed a civil crime of being in this country without documentation, rounding people up who have committed no crime in exercising their freedom of speech. The rhetoric around that kind of crackdown has relied and slipped back to this idea of us versus them, modern versus medieval. And in order to construct enemies, the current administration and some of its officials have slipped back into that usage. They use medieval to denote the things that they think are outdated, evil, nasty, when in fact, they are the ones who could probably stand to learn from history. Now, I say that because in the Middle Ages, torture was not used with impunity. Torture was not used everywhere. There were many, many people who actually argued against the use of torture in medieval judicial process. So, when we're talking about torture, a lot of our impressions are just based on those medieval images. One that I've written on several times before is this image, the symbolism of the blood eagle. If you've ever seen the History Channel's The Vikings, that series started really well. It's based on Ragnar Lothbrok's saga. I mentioned it in my first episode. Now, at one point, they use the blood eagle as a form of execution. Again, that would be punishment, not torture. But recently, in the Medieval Academy's journal Speculum, some medical historians with a literary historian wrote about the idea of the blood eagle as torture and whether or not you could actually torture somebody using that process. Now, for those of you who've not seen the series Vikings, the Blood Eagle, according to the actual sources, and there are only 9 references, and they're all literary, and in some ways they're actually all related to one another. In those sources, the Blood Eagle means, or at least it implies, taking your sword, running it down somebody's back, opening up their back, cutting through the ribs, pulling out their ribs from behind so that they look like wings, removing the lungs and laying them on the victim's shoulder and watching them slowly lose breath, almost like wings. Now, the chances that this actually happened are highly unlikely. Medically, it's possible, but it's going to take you a minute. And in the sources, in the Old Norse Icelandic sagas that talk about it, and in the skaldic poetry, the first references aren't quite so clear. It says that the back was scored like an eagle. In some cases, it even says possibly that an eagle was drawn on somebody's back with the sword. Okay, that's possible. But it would have been post-mortem. If it was done at all, it would have been post-mortem. And it's certainly not going to be a method of interrogation because you're going to have to kill that person. The second you cut down the sides of their spines, you're severing the brachial artery, and they're going to bleed to death in seconds, maybe a minute, but they're going to bleed out pretty fast. So you're not asking them any questions, but also if you crack their ribs open and pull out their lungs, if that's even a possible thing to do in any amount of time on a battlefield, maybe after the battle, they're going to die pretty quick and not be able to tell you anything anyway. Blood Eagle is one of those things that is most likely a literary motif and a little bit like a game of telephone. The original texts make a reference, and later texts build on it, and later authors go, ooh, let's make that even worse. How can we think of something really nasty and horrible? I know, we'll crack their ribs open from their back and pull out their lungs and put their lungs on their shoulders. Sure. Was it ever actually done? Unlikely. There is no archaeological evidence to support that. Nobody has found any corpses in graves where the ribs are pulled back because that's all you have. You'd only have the skeletal evidence because you're clearly not going to have the soft tissue. There is no evidence in Icelandic law that that was ever a prescription or a punishment for any noted crime. What we have is a literary device that gets exaggerated from text to text. And then Michael Hirst, the director of Vikings, read it and read about it. And in interviews, Michael Hirst has said that he wanted to use the worst possible punishment that existed for the Vikings. First of all, I've said this before, Viking is a title. It's a part-time summer job, not an ethnicity. Second of all, the laws in each individual Scandinavian country that had Vikings were different. Third, it doesn't actually exist in the legal texts as an actual ascribed punishment for anything. So while Michael Hirst was going for that popular culture aspect, it's largely a modern fantasy, a modern medievalism. And the TV series Vikings, which has some really interesting ideas, but also has some serious problems because it, includes some history and some historical events. But if you had the same set of Vikings doing all the things those Vikings did, they'd have lived for 200 years, at least. Even though the depiction of it is done in keeping with the literary texts to an extent, it is not actually historically valid. We have no actual evidence that it was ever done. But if it was, it would have been punishment, not torture. But popular culture doesn't really care about that kind of distinction. In fact, the idea of medieval torture, the idea that medieval torture was such a thing, is partly encoded by the film Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction from the 90s, you have this scene where Ving Rhames, who's been brutalized by white supremacists, gets a chance to get back at them. And when he has them at his mercy, he says, I'm going to get medieval on your ass. Now, he means he is going to brutalize one of those white supremacists the same way they brutalized him. And the implication is because they're in a BDSM violent torture setting, like a torture chamber, and that is not a dig at the BDSM community. This is just how they portray it in Pulp Fiction. Because they're in that dungeon setting, and he says, I'm going to get medieval on your ass, that associates the practice of brutality somehow with the medieval mindset. And like I said, modern politics has latched onto that. For the last 20 years, that has been a catchword, code for describing somebody as brutal or barbaric, to call them medieval. And it is back again in modern political parlance, particularly in the United States. But I will point out that torture and American national identity have actually always been at odds. Whatever you want to say about the hideous institution of enslavement and forced migration, where human beings were in fact punished and tortured in brutal ways, an actual legal process of employing torture as part of American judicial process did not exist. Enslavement was horrific. What slaveholders did was horrific. But American law at the time actually prohibited torturing other white people. In 1775, George Washington specifically says, should any American soldier be so base and infamous as to injure any prisoner, I do most earnestly enjoin you to bring him to such severe and exemplary punishment as the enormity of the crime may require. Should it extend to death itself, it will not be disproportional to its guilt at such a time and in such cause, for by such conduct they bring shame, disgrace, and ruin to themselves and their country. Now, he's talking about torture. He says that if any American soldier uses torture, they are violating the very tenets of American justice and the idea of American freedom, for which they were allegedly fighting in 1775. Now, he says that to the Northern Expeditionary Force, and he makes it part of his process and part of his rules and regulations that no British soldiers, no Hessian soldiers, nobody fighting for the other side could be subjected to interrogatory torture. No one. And any American soldier who did it, oversaw it, or ordered it was to be dealt with severely, potentially punished with death. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, who of course famously suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War and essentially declared martial law after the South traitorously seceded, Lincoln wouldn't go that far either. Lincoln specifically says, if torture isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. So no matter what tactics or strategies the North was willing to employ during the American Civil War, torture wasn't one of them. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed an executive order ensuring lawful interrogation, and he declared in his first address to the Joint Houses of Congress, without equivocation, the United States does not torture. He had to say that. He had to say it because before 2009, the United States had introduced enhanced interrogation into its legal apparatus, particularly against Al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorists, but also in the process of questioning military prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. And I will point out that the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, served in Gitmo and has expressed his desire to bring back those illegal methods of enhanced interrogation. And I say illegal because the Geneva Conventions after World War II made it very clear that the application of torture by any state institution was illegal. They violated international law, and the United States signed on to the Geneva Conventions. So when we talk about the way that modern society likes to envision torture as this medieval thing, it's actually fair to say torture has become far more prominent and used far more widely in the last 100 years of the modern era than it ever was in the Middle Ages. So part of what a lot of American politicians and a lot of people in the media and the news, part of what they're trying to do when they use medieval to talk about torture, brutality, and define something as medieval that is violent and brutal, it's an attempt to distance modern practice from the past, to basically say, they were medieval. They did that. When in fact, we're doing it. And it's happening all over the world as I speak. And in fact, politicians, comedians, dissidents have railed against this particularly since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Stephen Colbert actually lampooned the defense of torture by former President Bush and his administration as an interrogation technique in a Justice Department memo dated August 2002. And he reminded his audience, that's Colbert, reminded his audience that President Bush said the United States does not torture in 2006. So by definition, anything you do is not torture. So I say, go medieval. Now, Colbert is making fun of the Bush administration for, on the one hand, saying we don't torture, but then also advocating torture. And so Stephen Colbert uses the medieval phrase from Pulp Fiction to make fun of it. So, in short, despite a modern cultural desire to displace torture onto a medieval other, torture has not faded into the murky realms of the past. And as public debate continues on a global scale in a variety of current and immediate crises, it's important to look more deeply into that past and investigate modern assumptions of medieval acceptance of torture. And that investigation, in some ways, rests largely on literature. Now, popular history, Barbara Tuchman, in her book about a distant mirror, the calamitous 14th century, and that tells you something right there, the calamitous 14th century. It's a very good, very detailed book, but Barbara Tuchman wrote it in 1978, and she created this image of medieval villages that had bodies hanging from gibbets and people being pulled apart all the time. I mean, she partly fed into that. And one of my favorite novels is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And of course, Umberto Eco talks about Bernardo Gui, who's an actual inquisitor from the Middle Ages. He's an early 14th century inquisitor. But Umberto Eco makes him the ultimate bad guy. And in the book, torture is part of the debate on monastic piety and the financial machinations of the friars, whether or not friars can be poor, because the Franciscan friars wanted to be poor, but the Dominicans and Benedictines and powers said, no, the church has to have all this money. And there were all these debates about monastic poverty and the friars being poor and mendicant being beggars. All of that gets tied up in The Name of the Rose, in a murder mystery, which is awesome, and in the presence of the Inquisition. So Umberto Eco touches on all these different aspects in The Name of the Rose. And then the movie, which is fantastic, with Sean Connery as William of Baskerville, who investigates all of this, and a very young, adorable Christian Slater as Adzo, his compatriot, companion. That whole film really captures the brutality of Bernardo Gui, played by F. Murray Abraham, and Ron Perlman as Salvatore, who's tortured hideously to confess. And he essentially confesses to witchcraft. That's all bollocks. And that's the thing about interrogation through torture. It rarely, if ever, actually works. Torture rarely, if ever, produces the truth. For medieval audiences, the idea of torture was that you were trying to get at the truth. You were trying to get to, quote, the queen of proofs. The queen of proofs is that confession. So when we talk about laws regarding medieval torture, the earliest body of evidence comes from about Paris in 1210. Now, before that, there was a whole debate. In the late 12th century, you have dissenting voices. You have those philosophers of law like Gratian, one of the greatest 12th century scholars of ecclesiastical law, in his Concordia Discordantium Canonum, or Decretum for short, which is about 1140. In the Decretum, Gratian argues against the use of torture. He says confession is not to be extorted by the instrumentality of torture, because he felt that it was an accurate way of discerning the truth. I will also point out that, of course, if you look up Gratian's Decretals, it has some of the most amazing marginalia. One of them is one of my favorite images. It's the flying penis monster with a naked woman sitting astride it. And if you're sitting here going, what does that have to do with anything? It doesn't. That image in Gratian's Decretum has nothing to do with the text itself. The text is a legal treatise. The text is this whole discussion of legal treatises. And we will have another episode where we talk about medieval sex, but also where we talk about those margins and the marginalia that very often was seriously disconnected from the subject in the manuscript. But in 1140, Gratian is arguing against the use of torture. And that's because torture wasn't part of Roman law yet. Roman law, that is, the laws that were applied during the Roman Empire, largely fell by the wayside. So at the end of the 12th century, the beginning of the 13th century, there is a quote-unquote rediscovery of Roman law. And that Roman law was used by the church as canon law, the official canons of the church by which the church determined how priests, how prelates, how clerics could behave, should behave, what they should, what they shouldn't do. And those were constantly shifting things. The legal history of the medieval church is varied and it changes. And you have a variety of different councils that debate those issues and come up with a set of rules. And then you might have another council a few years later that completely reverse them. Now, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 is one of those councils that establishes several rules as doctrine for the Catholic Church. The Fourth Lateran Council decreed that priests were prohibited from shedding blood. They could not engage in any act of judicial interrogation or punishment or any other act that might draw blood. Now, that's a bit of a problem, considering how many popes, like Urban II, encouraged people to go shed blood for Christianity. But as long as the priests weren't doing it, and if they did, they could get absolved, it was okay. But the Fourth Lateran Council specifically introduces interrogatory torture as the queen of proofs. As in, You get a confession, and that's it. Case closed. But it didn't just say you could apply torture all the time. It didn't just say, okay, you've got somebody who's suspected of a crime. I have accused you, torture them, get them to confess, and we're done. That is not how that worked. Before the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the standard system by which guilt was determined or not was a system of ordeals. Now, the ordeals, somebody says, I accuse you of a crime. You've got to prove you didn't do it. But it's not about evidence. It's about whether or not you can withstand an ordeal. And those ordeals might be trial by fire, trial by water, trial by iron, trial by combat. And you're thinking, what the fuck is all of that? Trial by iron or water often involved having a boiling cauldron, for lack of a better word, of water. And at the bottom of it was an ingot of metal. And the accused had to stick their hand in, pull out that hot metal, or sometimes it was heated up in the fire. They had to hold it for a prescribed amount of time, let it go. Their hand would have been bound, sometimes treated if they were smart, and then the wound would be checked about 3 days later. And if the wound was festering, you were guilty. If it was healing, you were innocent. Now, that raises all kinds of questions about medieval medical care, which is a whole nother episode in and of itself. But enough medieval people understood the curative properties of things like honey. And so you could easily have a physician just treat that, bind it, and in 3 days, oh, look, it's healing and you haven't got a fever and you haven't developed pus. There's a whole debate. The great suppuration debate of the 12th century, where medieval medical authorities debated, is pus a good thing or is pus a bad thing? That's a whole nother episode too. But I digress. This was not about guilt or innocence. This was about the ability of people to withstand some kind of violence, some kind of pain, and heal from it. And it was seen that God ruled in someone's favor if they were healing. Therefore, they were innocent. Trial by combat, it's the same thing. In fact, there are all kinds of literary texts that talk about trial by combat. Lancelot, Guinevere. So much of the Arthurian tradition revolves around their adulterous and treasonous affair and trials by combat. The thing about that is that says more about Lancelot's ability to kick somebody's ass in a list or one-to-one combat than it does about their innocence. Because generally speaking, when Lancelot has to defend Guinevere, particularly against the charges of adultery, they're not innocent. Depending on the text, it's pretty clear that they were shagging each other. And in fact, that highlights the failings of that ordeal system. So the church was interested in making sure that the people who were punished were actually guilty. And as a consequence, they used interrogatory torture to pull out that queen of proofs. But you had to have 2 forms of proof against you to begin with. They couldn't just randomly torture people and get them to confess to a crime that they potentially didn't commit. In order to even subject somebody to torture, you had to have some kind of half-proof against them. And then you could apply torture in very regulated circumstances. And if somebody died in the process of interrogation, the judge was held liable. Because if you kill somebody in the process of torture, you're not doing it right. Because if you kill them, you can't punish them. And punishment was actually the point, not the torture. Because the punishment might be a public spectacle that was designed to reify the strength and power of the authority conducting the trial. So you might have torture applied, but it would generally be speaking be applied in secret, or not really so much secret, but be applied as part of that judicial process, not producing the outcome itself of a guilty verdict. So, after 1215, you start to see even more laws that introduce torture as part of that interrogation process. In France, an ordinance of Louis IX in 1254 allows it, but it forbade the torture of honest people of good reputations, including the poor, on the basis of the testimony of a single witness. So you couldn't have one guy who just says, oh, he's guilty, and then torture that guy and get him to confess to what the one guy said. You had to have two forms of proof. And that question of honest people of good reputations is actually very important, because you couldn't subject somebody of good reputation to torture with impunity. Because if they had a good reputation, they had standing in the community, and that wasn't based on their social or economic status. It was based on whether or not the community knew them to be honest and truthful people. Now, by 1252, Pope Innocent IV licenses the use of torture to obtain evidence from suspects. And by 1256, the inquisitors were allowed to absolve each other if they used the instrument of torture themselves rather than relying on lay agents. Now, remember, I said the Fourth Lateran Council said clerics couldn't shed blood. Okay. So if you've got to subject somebody to some kind of violence in order to interrogate them and extract a confession, and you're going to use some nasty method to do it, you can't draw blood. So the clerics themselves didn't do it. They relied on lay people. They hired out inquisitors or torturers to actually conduct that torture. Also, if they were going to do it, there are plenty of ways to torture somebody without drawing blood. That's where the rack comes in. Now, a little aside about the rack. The rack that you normally see in a lot of images are these sophisticated platforms. They are almost like a framework with wheels and winches and ropes and somebody stretched across it. Those are mostly images from the 16th century, post-Reformation, when people were being tortured far more frequently and with impunity by the secular and religious authorities who were caught up in the chaos of that schism between Catholic and Protestant. In fact, torture gets so bad and is used by so many secular authorities that people like Michel de Montaigne in 1580, he wrote an essay called Of Cannibals, in which he condemns the European use of interrogatory torture against fellow Europeans, against fellow Christians, and says, how dare we judge South American cannibals who eat the dead when we have people torn apart by dogs or subjected to horrific forms of torture simply because they believe in a different version of Christianity. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but the fact that Michel de Montaigne, who likely was in close proximity to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, that was essentially ordered by Charles IX as a whole big political plot to get rid of one. Well, actually, I take that back. I'm going to stop myself here and say he orders the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, but it was probably orchestrated as an assassination attempt by his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and his brother, Henry, Duke of Anjou, who becomes Henri III, Henry III, when Charles IX is assassinated by poison. Gets very twisted here. If you want to watch a good movie, see La Reine Margot. You want to read a good fictional, but not really that fictional book about it, read Alexandre Dumas' La Reine Margot, Queen Margot. It's all about this. But the use of torture by the French authorities in these wars of religion that culminates in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when Charles IX orders the massacre of all the Protestants who were in Paris for the marriage of his sister Margot to Henri of Navarre. In the space of 3 days, 3,000 Protestants are massacred in the streets of Paris simply because they're Protestant. And of course, all of that is a cover for Catherine de' Medici and Henri III's attempts to get rid of Admiral de Coligny, who was a Protestant advisor of Charles IX. That family was twisted for color TV on multiple levels. But Michel de Montaigne saw the application of torture by the French authorities in 1572, in the 1580s, and he writes his essay and condemns it. Now, that kind of brutality certainly exists post-Reformation, but medieval people, medieval authorities, rarely used that kind of brutality, and they rarely used torture the way that it gets used by the 16th century. So you do see a lot of legal recommendations about restraining interrogatory torture. Until the end of the 13th century, investigations were restrained by judicial precedent and rules. Pope Boniface VIII, however, in his Liber Sextus in 1298, overturns some of those earlier restraints. And of course, by the time you get to the 14th century and the interrogation of the Knights Templar, certain parts of Europe were using torture with greater and greater frequency. So in 1307, on October 13th, that's Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip the Fair, Philip le Bel, has the French Knights Templar arrested. He has them rounded up and arrested. Now, the reason he has them arrested is because he owes them a great quantity of money. They're very powerful. They are the only Christians given a special dispensation by the Pope to lend money at interest. And Philip has borrowed money from them, and he doesn't want to pay his bill. That's part of it. They were also just very powerful, and they wouldn't bow to his authority. So Philip has the French Knights Templar rounded up and then subjected to all kinds of hideous torture. Now, that's actually where we get the idea that Friday the 13th is bad luck because of the Knights Templar. But this idea that the Knights Templar were this secret society, that they had all of these different secret rituals, that they were hoarding money, and that they have this treasure, and we've got popular cultures full of it. Thank you, Dan Brown. Thank you, National Treasure. It's true, they had a lot of treasure. It's true that they had a lot of wealth. It's true that they had some secret rituals, but not nearly to the extent that popular culture has imagined. And part of popular culture's imagination comes from the 137 charges levied against them. And those are nonsense. I talked about them in the first episode. Things like waving their private parts at the Eucharist or worshiping the head of John the Baptist, maybe, or a Baphomet. Maybe they're the same thing. Who knows? The charges are ridiculous. But Philip needs the Templars to confess because he needs them to be discredited. He needs grounds to get the Pope, Clement V, who owes his papacy to Philip, to excommunicate them and take their property. Because it's all about taking their property, ultimately. Now, Clement, since he owes his papacy to Philip, and in fact, it's the aftermath of the torture of the Templars in 1307 that inspires Clement to move the papacy from Rome to Avignon in 1309. Because this is a controversy that just keeps going, like the Energizer Bunny. The Templar controversy would not go away. Because yes, the leaders of the French Templars confess. Jacques de Molay confesses. Wouldn't you? If somebody subjects you to horrific pain and does horrible things to your body, wouldn't you confess? And that's the problem. Torture rarely works. People will confess to anything under torture. And in this instance, they did. They confessed to all of those charges. But the confession doesn't actually lead to their punishment. They confess, so they're imprisoned. And ideally, Philip was able to then seize their assets and seize their treasure. That's where we get an awful lot of the rumors about the fact that the Knights Templar treasure is gone, it disappears. Where did it go? Buried under the crypt of Rosalind. I looked for it. Okay, that's a little tongue-in-cheek. Entirely. Thank you, Dan Brown. But they confessed, and they remain in prison. And because Jacques de Molay and the others remain in prison, he recants his confession. They all do. All the leaders of the Knights Templar recant their confessions. They publicize the fact that they were tortured into confessing, something that they did not do. And so what happens is the rest of the Knights Templar who arrested elsewhere didn't necessarily confess because they were not tortured. And when Jacques de Molay and the rest of them recant, all of a sudden Philip and Clement are panicking. They need them to be punished. They need them to not recant their confessions. And ultimately they're tortured again. And ultimately Jacques de Molay and the other leaders of the Knights Templar are burned at the stake in 1314 for heresy. But it's all nonsense. It's all bollocks. At the exact same time, other authorities refused to employ torture. Edward II, who became king shortly after the Knights Templar in France were rounded up in 1307. I mean, he was a brand new king, and he was engaged or newly married to Philip's daughter. So the brand new King of England, and ignore the portrayal of him in Braveheart, because that's a whole nother mess of bollocks, which I'll address in another episode too. Maybe we'll have a whole episode on popular medievalisms. That's highly likely. Edward II stands up to Philip and says, no, torture is against English common law. So he doesn't do it. He refuses. And the inquisitors are really kind of miffed. They actually ask, and there are letters that survive of the inquisitors in England asking the Pope, can we please move these proceedings to French territory where torture is legal? We need to rendition them because the English king refuses to torture them. And eventually, under pressure, in about 1310 and then 1311, Edward II agrees to allow those interrogations and allows the use of torture. And I'm paraphrasing, as long as it doesn't hurt them. He says, sure, you can use torture, but just don't hurt them, which contravenes the entire purpose of torture. But the end result is that the English knights are not tortured. Thus, they are never convicted of anything. And eventually they're just released and released back into their natural population. And when the Order of the Knights Templar is disbanded in 1314, several of those English Templars just join other monastic orders. They join the Knights, the Teutonic Knights. They join the Knights Hospitaller. They just kind of get absorbed into that existing fabric of other knightly orders. They don't necessarily go underground, and they certainly don't start the Masons. The Masons associate themselves with the Templars, but it's not a direct line. So, torture is part of the European judicial process, starting really in 1215. And technically, torture never ceases to be legal in parts of Spain, especially Castile, but it is abolished in Aragon in 1325. And it's mentioned in the Statutes of Vienna in the middle of the 13th century in the form of a prohibition, though, where they were saying don't use it. But of course, regional law codes vary. And as the Middle Ages progresses, you have an awful lot of individual communities that reject the use of torture in law. And as I said, you've got all those dissenting voices, not only Gratian, but citizens protested informal torture against fellow citizens, of people of good repute. Like I said, you couldn't torture somebody who had a good name. And if you tried, your citizens were going to protest. And of course, the principles of due process, including the presumption of innocence, were actually an important part of late medieval continental law. It's also part of the Magna Carta that was signed by King John in England in 1215. A lot happened in 1215. But this idea in English law that people were entitled to a jury trial, a trial of their peers, is one of the reasons that interrogatory torture is not introduced in England. And so when you have these ideas of due process that existed, and we in the modern era could really stand to take note of this, due process has always been an essential part of European criminal law. It is one of the reasons that the criminal justice system, as flawed as it is in this country, was based on the precepts of Magna Carta from 1215. There's a reason there's a copy of the Magna Carta in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., right by the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Because whatever else they did, the framers of the Constitution based due process on Magna Carta and this idea that everybody was entitled to be proven guilty in a jury trial. We are getting away from that in this country, and we are swiftly heading to a realm that is far from medieval. In fact, contravenes any sense of historical legal precedent. Due process, including the presumption of innocence, was an important part of late medieval continental law, and it was often thought better to leave a criminal unpunished than condemn an innocent person. That's a precept borrowed from classical Roman law, and it was recycled by medieval Roman lawyers. And like I said, it forms the basis, it is the foundation of American legal traditions in the Constitution. These things intersect. And the restrictions placed on the use of torture were part of that, because there was a sense of we are trying to find out for sure whether someone's innocent or guilty. They used torture, and in some cases they rejected it. In some cases it was always illegal. In fact, torture is never really acceptable in English law until Henry VIII. Henry VIII has a lot to answer for. I have mentioned this before. But it's Henry who introduces torture into the regular English legal process in about 1540 as part of his persecution of Protestants, dissenters, and everyone else. And of course, it's ironic that he introduces it, and he actually starts a bit earlier than 1540. It gets codified in 1540, but it's used against heretics or accused heretics like Anne Askew in 1536. And it's used in that whole process of interrogating people who are believed to be Protestant right before they execute them. The history of torture is bound up in the identity of Western Europe and its legal precedents. But medieval people did not embrace its use wholesale. And people who abused it did face the vox populi, the voice of the people. What this means for torture is that in England, throughout the Middle Ages, it's illegal. And it was outlawed again in 1640. You know, it's entirely possible that public complaint leads to torture's eventual restriction. and that authorities responded to popular dissent about the corruption of power and judicial procedure that's voiced openly or through the dissemination of various literary texts. Because literature is often our way of protesting, of producing satire, of giving the vox populi a platform. And, modern culture, like its early modern predecessors, where again, torture really picks up post Reformation, modern culture makes assumptions about the Middle Ages based on this desire to be different and to think that we've evolved from that and that, we have moved on from the barbarism of the Middle Ages. But medieval authors and poets had the same desire. They cast barbarians and tyrants as figures outside their own boundaries. And they placed torture in the hands of unjust persecutors rather than as agents of the law. And they do this because torture had a limited place in medieval society. It does exist. It is certainly abused. There are certainly those authoritarian systems and governments that, like Philip the Fair, used torture with impunity, used it to exercise their own, shall we say, system of retribution, but also for their own ends. I'm not trying to claim that torture wasn't used in the Middle Ages. It was. There are all kinds of nasty things that people devised to do to one another. And there's some pretty nasty punishments in the Middle Ages. But it is important to understand the difference between torture and punishment. And to understand the difference when we look at history between those systems put in place for corrupt reasons, those put in place for altruistic reasons that when it was discovered that they didn't work, they were abandoned. And a lot of medieval societies rejected torture wholesale. They didn't do it because to them, it violated their own sense of justice and their own sense of law. And I have to say this, particularly now, at this moment in time, understanding the medieval past, understanding things like torture and brutality and law and punishment, and how medieval people tried to grapple with the contradictions, both in a Christian faith that pleads for justice and mercy, but also an authority largely in the form of the Catholic Church that said, no, 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 we're going to use violence to achieve that Christian religious hegemony that we desire and to get people to fall in line. Medieval people had to reconcile that. And in some cases, they couldn't. Because authoritarianism and true Christian belief are anathema to each other. They contradict each other. Anybody who claims to subject others to horrific punishment, to detain them, to subject them to starvation, to subject them to hideous punishments in the name of a monotheistic religious ideologies, and Islam, Judaism, Christianity are all based on the same precepts. Anybody who uses those religions to persecute, punish, violate, massacre, starve, detain, deport innocent people without due process are guilty not of being medieval, but of violating all that we have learned since the Middle Ages. This is the problem with history. If we don't study it, we're condemned to repeat it. And then, if we turn a blind eye to it, we are incapable of hearing what we need to in the present. As we look at this modern political moment, and if we look at the medieval past, We need to see why medieval people changed their minds. We need to look at how medieval people rejected those institutions that violated their sense of mercy and justice. We have a lot to learn from understanding the medieval past. We better learn it. We better learn it fast because there is nothing medieval about what's happening now. So perhaps the phrase is less, I'm going to get medieval on your ass, and maybe I'm going to get early modern on your ass. That's a whole nother conversation. And I promise we will have an episode that talks about medieval punishment because punishment is a different thing. And punishment certainly got nasty. But punishment and a lot of those modes of punishment aren't as common as people think either. And on that note, I would like to thank you for joining me for this episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and I'm your host. And I look forward to seeing you or having you join me for the next episode